Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. The world calls for restraint. Israel continues to strike. The humanitarian disaster that is Gaza, as some aid finally gets in.
The first 100 days might be over, but President Trump is showing no signs of slowing down.
America will soon be greater than ever before.
So we're continuing to follow every twist and turn of this remarkable presidency.
And trying to make sense of what it all means for the US and for the rest of the world.
So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Malika Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Sky News Trump 100, wherever you get your podcasts.
Things continue to go from bad to worse in Gaza, and not just because of the continuing military assault. Israel has been preventing aid from entering for more than 2 months. Some have described it as a blockade, others a deliberate tactic of starvation. Certainly things have gotten so bad, it seems to have prompted the international community into saying enough is enough. We've seen ambassadors being summoned and sanctions being threatened. The language has definitely hardened. And aid is now getting in. But it may be too little too late. UN Humanitarian Aid Chief Tom Fletcher says 14,000 babies are at risk of death. Our Middle East correspondent Ali Bunkall joins us from Jerusalem. I mean, just on that, Alistair, that characterisation of the scale of the potential catastrophe, 14,000 dead babies.
Yeah, so that was a warning given by Tom Fletcher, who's a former British ambassador to Lebanon, but now head of a major UN agency that looks after humanitarian affairs and particularly a focus on Gaza. So really stark warning from him. There are some suggestions that figure might have come from a report issued by the IPC a little bit of time ago. The IPC is the organisation that can determine one way or another whether or not a famine is official or not. And they did release a report saying that by March, 14,000 children under the age of 6 could be facing severe malnutrition. It does certainly put into real stark reality the crisis facing Gaza now.
Given that every time we talk, we say the same thing, we should probably say it again. We are not personally in on the ground in Gaza, but we do have people in on the ground in Gaza. With what degree of accuracy can we describe exactly what the humanitarian situation is there right now?
Well, if you're lucky enough not to have been injured, you almost certainly will have had friends or family who have been injured or killed. So everybody knows someone who has been caught up, has lost family members. In many cases, entire families have been wiped out. I mean, I should say, the same goes for Israel. Everybody knows somebody who was caught up in October 7th or is now in the Israeli military fighting in Gaza or who has been. So, this is a war that is affecting both populations, in their entirety. If you're in Gaza, it's highly unlikely you've got anywhere stable to live. It's highly unlikely that your home is left standing. I think I saw a statistic the other day suggesting that more than 90% of homes in Gaza are no longer inhabitable. So you're probably sleeping in a tent or perhaps just out on the street or in the ruins of a building. You are scrabbling around for what food you can get. The siege has been 11 weeks, and so food is scarce, as is water, as are just basic products, sanitary products, for example, baby formula. And the result of that is that, of course, you have rampant inflation. So what food is available is incredibly expensive. But then a lot of people don't have any money because they've not been earning a living for a year and a half. The security situation then unravels through desperation. And then, you'll find that suddenly the area that you are currently seeking shelter in, you'll suddenly find an evacuation order comes in from the Israeli military, giving you really very little time, possibly, if you're lucky, a few hours to get together your stuff, evacuate, and then get on the move. But then, of course, when you get on the move, vehicles aren't really an option. Fuel is scarce. Donkeys and carts can provide a slightly better form of transport than being on foot. But again, they cost an awful lot. The price of a donkey and cart from sort of northern to central Gaza or central Gaza to the south is now very, very expensive, and people don't have the money. So you're on foot. Where are you going to? You're going to an area, perhaps Al-Mawasi, for example, which supposedly is a safe zone. But where are you going to get a tent from? Or where, if you have a tent, are you going to pitch that tent? Because it becomes ever more crowded. And then we've called it a safe zone. And 3 days ago, there was an attack in it, and some of the tents burnt to the ground very quickly, and people were burned alive inside.
You have been speaking to some of the medical professionals working in and around Gaza, some of the Brits, in fact, working inside Gaza. I mean, what are they telling you about the conditions that they're facing right now?
A fair number of international medics and doctors who work inside Gaza. The NASA hospital is one of those. It has been attacked. Their entire burns unit is no longer operational because it took a direct strike. But that is where a small number of British doctors are currently. They'll be there for, I think, a few weeks up to a month. We've been speaking to them regularly. They are finding things incredibly difficult indeed. A lack of supplies, the severity of the injuries coming in, and then sort of day-to-day problems. I think it was 24 hours ago, most of Khan Yunis was declared a combat zone by the Israeli military. And so that meant that a lot of the local staff, the Palestinian medics, had to just, basically sort of abandon what they were doing, get back home, get their families, gather together what they could, and leave for a safe zone. And so that's just an example of how day to day you can have these kind of disruptions and how medical care can be very difficult. And then you add the malnutrition aspect, you layer that on top of everything, and people who are coming in with severe injuries just don't have necessarily the sort of the natural energy or body fat that most people when they go into hospital would have to give them that strength to recover.
We have heard from the Israeli authorities that aid is now starting to get back in to Gaza, of which more in a second. But Alistair, up until this point, what has been Israel's justification for keeping those crossing points closed, for stopping aid getting into Gaza?
To put pressure on Hamas. That has been the Israeli strategy. When aid was going into Gaza, particularly during the previous ceasefire, when there was quite a lot of aid getting in, 500, 600, 700 trucks a day, Israel strongly believes, and there is some evidence to back this up, that Hamas were taking it and then selling it to make money. I suppose, therefore, you could say it is to starve Hamas into kind of a submission, to starve them into a surrender, to starve them into a new ceasefire deal on Israel's terms. But of course, you are also having the same effect on the wider population. And so that is why it is broadly seen internationally as being collective punishment.
Do we think that the aid now flowing into Gaza is going there in sufficient quantities, or is it a bit like trying to use a packet of crisps to feed 1,000 people?
I'm speaking to you about lunchtime here in Jerusalem on Wednesday afternoon. About 9 trucks were cleared to enter on Monday. 5 did. And I think around 90 or so trucks were cleared to enter Gaza yesterday. But what the UN said yesterday evening, the latest update I've seen, is that although those trucks went across the border, so they were checked by the Israelis on the Israeli side, they were then cleared to cross the short border crossing into effectively a car park on the other side of the border, into a sort of sterile zone. But none of them have then, the UN said, moved beyond that, because the Israelis, the United Nations say, were then insisting that the aid was unloaded from the original lorries that made the border crossing and then reloaded into new trucks. And the UN has been unable to do that, and the UN has been unable to get this aid to their warehouses and distribution sites. And so as we know it right now, as I speak to you, some aid has managed to make it across the border into Gaza, but not to the mouths that need it.
Are you detecting on the part of the Israeli government any interest in the condemnation that seems to be coming from the West right now? We saw that joint letter from the leaders of the United Kingdom, France and Canada yesterday. We're seeing people talking of sanctions. I mean, first and foremost, are the Israelis listening? Are they minded even to listen?
They're angry. I spoke to an Israeli official this morning, just said, what is your reaction to it? And they are angry. In terms of the British and the sanctions that Keir Starmer announced on Tuesday, they feel, particularly in relation to the suspension of free trade discussions, they feel that the UK is cutting off its nose to spite itself. And it was told to me on a couple of occasions that actually the NHS gets quite a lot of its medicine. They told me that about 1 in every 7 items of medicine comes from Israeli suppliers. And so the argument being from the Israelis that actually by pausing free trade negotiations, you are going to affect your average Briton. I think they don't quite understand why Britain has turned, and not just Britain, I mean France, Canada as well, in recent days have released strong statements. They don't quite understand why they've turned against Israel in this way. They think that it is playing into Hamas's hands. But as to, whether or not Israel will listen, I don't, in terms of the measures taken so far by European countries, that's not going to have an effect. The EU is going to review its partnership with Israel, and if it decides to take any further action on that, yeah, possibly. If the UK government takes out sanctions against Israeli government ministers, possibly that might have a consequence. I don't know. What I've been long convinced by is that really the only person who can have an influence on Benjamin Netanyahu, one way or the other, is Donald Trump. And at the moment, although we hear that behind the scenes, Trump might be telling the Israelis to wrap it up and enough is enough, at least in public, the US president doesn't seem to have changed his position at all.
What is taking place on the ground or elsewhere right now, in your mind, bearing in mind you're in Jerusalem and I'm in London, I'm asking you to opine on the British government's mindset here, but why now?
I think you should look at the language that is being used by some senior Israeli ministers, particularly Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, speaking in the last couple of days about the situation in Gaza, saying that, only the bare minimum of food will be allowed in, basically in order that Israel doesn't lose international support, and that Gaza would be entirely taken over by Israel and Gazans would be forced out to some other country elsewhere. And I think it's a combination of these things, and the very heavy bombardment that has really changed attitudes in European capitals. And I suspect probably, particularly, the close relationship between Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron that we've seen on a number of different levels over recent months, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a bit of coordination going on there as well.
But isn't it just damn hypocritical of the British to have waited this long? I mean, just putting myself in the mindset of some of those who have been very critical about the Israeli government's response to the October the 7th attacks. I mean, that it has taken an Israeli minister to say, we are going to take over Gaza and Gazans will have to find somewhere else to live. I mean, people would say, well, look at what Israel has been doing. Isn't that evidence that was the strategy all along? Why did we need to wait for an Israeli minister, junior minister, to actually say it?
Some Israeli ministers have been saying it all along. I mean, the likes of Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, he is a senior influential figure and loud voice within the Israeli government. He lives in a settlement in the West Bank, and he has long held the view that Gaza should be reoccupied by Israel. So he's articulated that all along. It's just that I think now, for most people, it seems as though what might have been kind of an unbelievable prospect is now actually becoming really quite potentially realistic. A lot of people probably will say, why is the British government not taking this tough stance towards Israel a long time ago? As ever with politics and diplomacy, there's an awful lot to balance. And I think European politicians in particular tend to prefer in the first instance a sort of a softly approach and an attempt to try and influence it through conversations behind the scenes. And it might be that they feel that they've got nowhere and they've given up on that, and so that they need to take a different stance. But I have never, in all my years covering the Middle East and Israel and living in Israel, I've never known a British government to be so strong in its language as it has been in the last couple of days.
For the very latest on what's going on in and around Gaza, just head to the website skynews.com. The Daily's back tomorrow.
The first 100 days might be over, but President Trump is showing no signs of slowing down.
America will soon be greater than ever before.
So we're continuing to follow every twist and turn of this remarkable presidency.
And trying to make sense of what it all means for the US and for the rest of the world.
So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Malta Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Sky News Trump 100, wherever you get your podcasts.